get some other perspective. We can speak to Zsolt Kerner, a senior reporter for the news site 24.hu. Hello to you, Zsolt. Thank you for speaking to Paris Direct. I don't know if you heard our correspondent there talking about, efforts to make sure this is a free and fair election in Hungary. Is it free or is it fair?
Yes, it is. The question was never whether Fidesz can steal the election. The whole electoral system was designed to help them win elections. They didn't really expect the political field to change that much. So now that the electoral system that they designed to help them sort of favors the other opposition party.
Yeah, this is talking about the reforms from 2012. It's a very complex system, isn't it? Could you explain it to our international viewers? Also, the bit about a bonus for whoever wins.
This system is sort of a mix between the British and the German system. So we have 199 members of parliament, and all political power comes from a majority in parliament. And Fidesz's political power comes from Orban's supermajority in parliament. There are individual constituencies, and they are a bit more important than the party lists. So there are 106 of those. And mostly who wins the majority in parliament depends on who wins the majority in those constituencies. Some of those constituencies are heavily gerrymandered. So a rural countryside constituency vote basically is worth almost 1.5 than a pegged-in urban vote. And that heavily favored Fidesz in the past. And there is a very unique Hungarian thing called the winner compensation, where above a certain threshold, if you dominate in one constituency, the votes transfer over to the party list. So that can also boost the candidate that dominates in rural constituencies. The question is whether Fidesz still dominates in rural constituencies, and we are not sure about that anymore.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, Viktor Orban has been in power for 20 years, 16 consecutively. How did it get to this, that now he's facing his biggest test yet?
It's mostly the economy. So since the last elections, 4 years have passed, and in those 4 years, there was basically no economic growth in Hungary. Most Hungarians can feel that if they vote for Viktor Orban, then there is no chance to get any sort of EU funds. And for several years, even before these 4 really bad years, EU funds were basically the only guarantee for an economic growth. There also was a huge inflation shock that shocked most Hungarians. Budapest and the countryside are really expensive now. Surprisingly so, even I think for foreign correspondents who are coming here to Budapest. So most Hungarians think about their finances before voting, and that's exactly what Péter Magyar ran on. So the difference from the start was that Péter Magyar focused on domestic issues while campaigning. He did a textbook campaign, touring the country, touring small towns, shaking hands and talking about domestic problems and issues. Viktor Orban, meanwhile, ran a very online campaign, an uncharacteristically online campaign compared to his previous campaigns. And he talked about foreign policy. He talked about how experienced he is, how he can reach basically everybody else, and the outside influence he undoubtedly has on the world stage. But it's not by design that he campaigned on foreign policy. It's because he doesn't have any domestic successes to campaign on. So it wasn't his first choice.
Yeah, and this is what we often see in countries around the world. When people go to the ballot box, they're voting on their pocketbook, how their daily lives are affected by the economy, for better or for worse. But if Péter Magyar does win, do we have any idea what his foreign policy would look like and how different a government led by him would be from one led by Orban?
He's decidedly more pro-European, and in recent weeks he started to talk a bit more about his pro-European policies and about how Viktor Orban is really a pro-Russia candidate in Hungary. But given that he and most of his staff is from early Fidesz governments, he would probably be most similar to early Fidesz governments. So 16 years passed since Viktor Orban got into power, and a lot is changed in Fidesz's policies. Not a lot of people remember now, but early Fidesz was a sort of pro-European centrist right-wing party, a member of the European People's Party in the EU. They were always contrarian, so they always argued for Hungarian national interest. But in early times, those were actually Hungarian national interests. So they could be reasoned with, they could be made a compromise with. It was much easier to understand for other right-wing parties in the EU what Hungary actually wants. And I expect something of a return to that. So they will argue in some cases, they will be contrarian in some cases. They will probably heavily support Hungarian interest, but they could be reasoned with that. They could be made a compromise with.
Yeah, and that's an important point to bring up for our viewers, that Viktor Orban has shifted over this time in power. And you do have to go back a ways, but as you say, he was pro-Western at one point. Why and when did that shift begin?
It's very interesting that his shift to being a more pro-Russia candidate was very gradual, and I don't think that there was ever a red line that he crossed, and there was no going back from that. The more interesting thing is, I think, on the ability to be able to make compromises. So in some cases, overwhelming power can block you in making compromises. He had so little opposition in Hungary that basically Hungarian audiences who were against Viktor Orban tended to look for Brussels to be a check on Viktor Orban's power. And in that case, every compromise made in Brussels could seem like a loss for Viktor Orban on the political stage at home. So every sort of compromise he made had a higher and higher actual worth for him, and it was harder and harder to make compromises. So his overwhelming power at home made him very unflexible in Brussels. And that's why for the last few weeks, I think he crossed several red lines that has been basically no going back from
Yeah,
here.
and again, if we talk about Peter Magyar going to power, he'll be in a similar tricky position from wanting to get that EU funding out of Brussels, but also being in a tricky position because of Hungary's geographical location and relying on Russian energy. So how would he navigate that, and what sort of compromises would he have to make?
These are the most important questions that we will have to ask in the next weeks. Sadly, the Hungarian political discourse has polarized so much that we haven't really had an actual honest conversation about what will happen after the elections. Basically, everybody knows that the situation is very bad. There's an energy crisis. Hungarian economy is in very bad shape. State finances are horrible. So anybody wins today, they have to have hard decisions to make. And it's getting harder and harder to get the EU money. Poland's case was easier. I think Brussels learned a lot from that. It would be harder for Hungary to get the same amount of funds. Luckily, it's mostly the member states' decision, and if they really want to help out somebody, then they can.
Yeah, you mentioned the national conversation and the discourse and the conversations that have to be had after Election Day. I'm wondering, though, you have Orban, who represents the populist right, Magyar, the center right. Where is the political left in all of this, and how much influence do they have or not have?
Well, Peter Magyar basically finished them off. So it's a really interesting thing to see. Hungary is finally becoming more similar to Poland, where there wasn't really a huge left-wing coalition in recent years. There are smaller parties now, but basically there's a center-right and a hard-right party. It doesn't mean that in a classical political sense they are all right-wing parties. For example, Viktor Orban's fiscal policies are quite left-wing in some cases. That is very similar to a lot of populist parties, while Peter Magyar's economic policies tend to be a bit more right-wing than the current governments are. But the left is basically the biggest loser probably of this rise of Peter Magyar. So there is no other liberal or left-wing party that really have a chance to get into parliament now.
I know you mentioned before that a lot of the people who are going to the polls today, and we're expecting perhaps record turnout in Hungary, are probably voting based on the economy. A lot of international media focusing on this election because of what's at stake with the war in Ukraine, with the rule of law, with Hungary's relationship with the EU. How would you characterize this, though? Is Hungary at a crossroads?
It certainly is. This what there are often that politicians say like these big and long-standing things that this decision is for years to come, but it really seems to be a decision for the ages. If Viktor Orban wins this election, that's a hard decision for from the Hungarians, and it has meanings for Europe and Hungary's membership in the European Union. And there would be, I think, consequences later. If Magyar wins, then that is a clear and honest repudiation of the policy Viktor Orban did in recent years, even though most Hungarians voted on economic terms, but it's still a repudiation of Viktor Orban's policies in foreign affairs as well.
Yeah, and regardless of who wins, Zsolt, I'm guessing you'll have a lot of reporting to do in the hours and days to come. Thank you very much, Zsolt Kerner, joining us from Budapest.